Joining me is Scott Atran. He's professor of psychology and public policy at the University of Michigan and Oxford University, also author of Talking to the Enemy, Faith, Brotherhood, and the Unmaking of Terrorists. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you here. I read your article with great interest, outlining the investigation you did into the effect of religion and being part of a religious group on intergroup cooperation and conflict with external groups. So for people who may not yet be familiar with that investigation, give us a brief overview of what you found out.
Well, I mean, the investigation goes across human history. I mean, we wrote an article in Science that goes from the archaeological evidence of prehistoric man all the way to modern times. But we've also run experiments around the world with political leaders in conflict zones. I've personally worked with terrorist groups around the world, mujahideen groups. And what we find is that religion in general has allowed large-scale cooperation between people who are not genetic relatives to take place. I mean, this is basically what got us out of the caves, what drives civilizations forward. But it also creates opportunities for conflict, of course, between groups that don't exist elsewhere in the biological world. And one of the reasons for that is that religion itself is based on transcendental notions that are, in fact, literally preposterous and absurd. For example, God is three in one, or is bodiless yet omnipotent. And the interpretation of these seemingly preposterous beliefs depends not on logic or empirical evidence, which have no bearing really on it, but they are confirmed by a sort of ritual collaboration, an emotional and almost physical bonding between people in prayer or in communion or in rituals of all sorts. And this marks cooperators, people who potentially come together for common defense and common endeavors, but it also separates them because it appears even increasingly bizarre to people on the outside, and so creates the possibilities of conflict.
I'm curious about I'm curious about a couple things. One is in your study you looked across cultures, you looked across various time periods. I'm curious whether there could be any sort of self-selection bias in the following sense, that those who are likely to be part of a religious group which would make it into your studies that you review would already have the social tendencies that you're attributing to being in a particular religious group. Can you say anything to that?
Well, I mean, the overwhelming majority of human beings, in fact, nearly all human beings, we're group animals. I mean, that's what allowed us to survive. Just to give you a very brief summary, we separated from Neanderthals about 200,000 years ago, and for the first 130,000 years of our existence, while Neanderthals and even smaller-brained Homo erectuses were running around the planet across all of Eurasia, from Indonesia to Europe, humans were stuck in Africa till 70,000 years ago, and they dwindled down to around 2,000 souls. But then suddenly, they broke out of Africa, and in a geological blink of the eye, they're traipsing about on the moon and dominate the entire planet. How did this happen? Well, Darwin says that if we were stronger animals, if we had stronger jaws, stronger backs, better muscles, then we probably wouldn't have evolved the need for a sort of group ability to form strong group coalitions that go beyond just our genetic relatives and families. But since we were so weak, the only way we did survive is to establish these large-scale cooperative groups. And the mutation probably that allowed it around 70,000 years ago is a mutation that is responsible jointly for language, syntax, and for theory of mind. It's sort of an internal mutation that allows people to think about possible worlds and to communicate about possible worlds with one another, to say, I know, that you know, that he knows, that she knows, and not to have to actually live through alternative scenarios, to be able just to think them through without having to experience them or even die from them. So we had to find mechanisms to build these large-scale groups. Language permitted it. It was the facilitator, along with theory of mind, that is the ability to read other people's minds, to attribute thoughts to them. But we needed some kind of mechanism to prevent exit strategies. The difference between a religious group and a group based strictly on a social contract if it's a matter of convenience in the social contract, then somewhere down the line, there's probably going to be a better deal, even in your imagination. And if there's a better deal down the line from another group, say, then you're more liable to defect. But if you are bound to it by a transcendental ideology, by a firm belief and commitment, then there is no exit strategy. And as Darwin said, those groups that have a high degree of patriotism, fidelity, and loyalty, and are ready to sacrifice for one another, are much more likely to triumph over other groups in the competition for resources and survival.
So let's talk in the little time we have left about the conflict part of it, because I'm interested in that as well. I think most people who watch this program certainly have an idea of how religion can cause conflict with those outside of that group. We see it certainly in American politics increasingly because of the religious polarization that's attached to the political polarization that exists. Is this a necessary aspect of religious groups, or is there a way to mitigate what I guess you're saying is kind of inherent conflict between groups, or is that just the way it is?
Well, religion is almost a neutral vehicle in terms of whether it's for the good or for the bad. Of course, it can be used for both.
Sure.
What happens when there are group conflicts, even conflicts over resources? Again, in order to prevent an exit strategy and to solidify defense and offense against the other groups, sacralizing those values becomes all important. A good example we have is we did a set of studies in Iran where we found that the nuclear program, which is not by any means any traditional Iranian deep cultural religious value, has become sacred through religious rhetoric and ritual among about 13% of Iranians. That 13% happens to be mostly rural Iranians that voted for the current regime. And what we find is that even mundane issues like whether to name something the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, or disputes over islands, or again over the nuclear program, has become sacralized and religious. Now, once that happens, then some interesting things occur. So, for example, supposing you want to trade off a sacred value, and we do this, say, would you give up the nuclear program for a great deal of aid, or to end sanctions? And under standard rational choice theory that dominates current political and economic theory, the more material benefits someone would accrue, the more likely they are to take a deal. We find the exact opposite happens when things become sacralized. The more money you offer people, or the more material disincentive, sanctions, the angrier people we get, the more violent they become, and the more likely they are to engage in conflict. We found this for Palestinians and Israelis as well. We found, for example, that if people offer money to families that give suicide bombers, then they're much less likely to give their kids over to suicide bombing, but they're also much more likely to be angry at their own people. If we ask them to give up something like the right of return among Palestinians to come back to Israel, or among the settlers, the Jewish settlers in the West Bank and Gaza, that they would give up the right to settle in Palestinian territories for an enduring peace, the more money, they don't like the deal to begin with. But if we offer them money, credible offers of money, they become very angry, they become violent, they support suicide, terrorism, or attacks against their own government. On the other hand, if the other side simply recognizes or respects those values, then things change drastically. So if the Israelis would apologize to the Palestinians, or if the Palestinians would recognize the right of the Jewish people simply to exist in that part of the world, then we find that even among the most hardcore militants, support for violence goes down drastically.
Absolutely fascinating. We've been speaking with Scott Atran, professor of psychology and public policy at the University of Michigan and Oxford University. Check out Talking to the Enemy, Faith, Brotherhood, and the Unmaking of Terrorists. Really a pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.